Summer Heights High is a particularly, I wouldn't say skewed, I would say ultra stereotypic portrayal of Pacific Islanders in Australia. But unfortunately some aspects of Summer Heights High are also fairly accurate for Sydney in particular. So there's been a large influx and migration of Pacific Islanders to Australia, many of them coming through New Zealand as well, and in New South Wales and also in Queensland there is a growing population of young Pacific people. And I actually thought Chris Lilly did a pretty good job of, researching the mannerisms of young male Pacific Islanders in Sydney. But I think what was a bit alarming for many Pacific people who watched it was the sheer amount of swearing that Jonah did, and what his father would say to him and what he would say to his father. Like, it's rare to hear Pacific Islanders talk to their parents that way, or for their parents to talk to them, because there's supposed to be a lot of respect between young people and older people. But I think what happens is in the diaspora, when you migrate overseas and culture starts to break down, a lot of those things change. I mean, and it's changing in the island countries as well. So I thought it was interesting that in Australia, some of the most visible portrayals of Pacific Islanders are fairly negative. So in the written press, in the news, online, even the kinds of stories that the ABC has covered about Pacific people are all about the rising number of criminals, the rising number of young male criminals, or young Pacific Islander men in the criminal justice system, mainly Polynesians. I think there's a huge challenge at the moment for Australia to really engage with the Pacific in a deeper way. I think at the moment Australia's engagement with the Pacific is quite limited to aid, development, and politics to an extent. I think under the Gillard government there's not going to be as much of an interest in the Pacific as there was under Kevin Rudd and certainly under John Howard. John Howard just had this intense sort of engagement, often quite negative, with Melanesia. And I think it's been a few decades since the general population in Australia was really interested in a deep way in the Pacific. There's such a major economic and political pull to Asia that it's almost like in Australia it's one or the other. They can't pay attention to both regions in a deep way at the same time. Now with the Pacific Islanders, it's almost like the Australian public has this huge gap, like memory gap, where they think the engagement with the Pacific is new, when in fact it's old. And Pacific Islanders have to figure out a way to get Australians to understand them better and not to view them just as this place where there is Australian aid and development money flowing, or Australian security forces. For example, in the Solomons, if you look at Pacific history and you understand better the way in which Australia engaged with Papua New Guinea, with Nauru, with Kiribati, with Fiji, Australia actually had these very intense economic relations where there was plantations and there was mining and there was a lot of resources that were extracted from the Pacific to fuel Australian development. And there is no history about that, no knowledge about that within the public, with museums, galleries, wherever you go, you can't see this very clear record of how Australia colonized Papua New Guinea and was the colonial administration there, how there was Australian sugar, phosphate mining, you name it, going on in the region. It's just not honored and recognized publicly. Yeah, so unlike, Asia or the West, there was no written culture in the Pacific. though people have been in the Pacific for thousands of years, in some places they've been there for 40,000 years, in other places for 6,000 or 3,000, and New Zealand's the most recently settled, which is about 800 to 1,000 years ago. And knowledge and history were not passed through the generations through writing, but were passed orally, or they were archived through the performing arts, through dance, through music, through chanting and poetry and storytelling, which meant people had to know. They couldn't rely on some system that is written somewhere, that is hidden somewhere, that is, stored somewhere, but they had to have this very active engagement and had to store knowledge and information in their minds. And that includes very complex genealogies, who's related to who and who the original ancestor is, and that in combination with carving, with sculpture, with architecture, with various patterns of tattooing on the body. All of these are sort of scripts that tell you something about history, about the past, about the ancestors, about those who have come before. So what's really interesting about the Pacific is that there are actually relations, genealogical relations, between the islands across very vast distances. So Hawaii all the way in the north, and New Zealand all the way in the south. And the Pacific is a huge ocean. It's 1/3 of the surface of the planet. It's massive. Those people understand that they're related to each other. They can, if you speak Hawaiian and you speak Maori, you can understand each other, even though they're two completely different languages. And there are genealogies and stories that go back through time that tell people how Maori and Hawaiians are related to each other, or Maori and Cook Islands, or Maori and Tahitians, or Hawaiians and Tahitians, how they're related to each other. And that's remembered over hundreds and hundreds of years. So that meeting that I was talking to you about was a group from Hawaii that came to New Zealand, and when they met each other, they talked to each other as kinfolk, not as visitors who have no connection whatsoever to each other. And that's one of the remarkable things about the Pacific, is that it's one of the most culturally and linguistically diverse regions on the planet, especially per capita, because it's a small population, but there's, over 1,200 languages, separate and distinct languages within a very small population. But people also understand how they're related to each other across vast distances, across, something that would take you hours to fly in a plane. People still remember, and that's one of the things that's disappearing with development and modernity and the urbanization of the Pacific, is this transfer of knowledge. Because if young people aren't interested in the knowledge, if they don't see the use of it, like, if it's not going to get them a job, then there's just not a lot of interest in holding and maintaining that knowledge.